So, we're going to talk about uh, diabetes tonight. This is a topic that is extremely popular, and I see by the numbers that I'm not wrong here. I get a ton of questions about diabetes, and I have to tell you, most people really need to know the right answers. So hopefully, we're going to cover that in this presentation. Let's start off first by looking at what diabetes is. We'll go through this quickly. Diabetes is when there's too much sugar that accumulates in the blood. For the most part, this sugar is in the form of what we call glucose. So you'll see and hear a lot about glucose measurements and controlling glucose. So let's just consider glucose and blood sugar as the same. Uh, Another two terms that we need to be accustomed to is hypoglycemia, which is a situation where blood glucose is too low, and hyperglycemia, which means blood sugar or glucose is too high. The main issue in diabetics is hyperglycemia, but hypoglycemia is often seen when a diabetic overcorrects himself with too much insulin or another sugar lowering medication. The way we normally control blood sugar or glucose is through the action of a substance called insulin. So glucose gets introduced into the bloodstream after we digest our food, and it's made available to our cells for energy. And the way that glucose gets into the cell is through insulin. Now, the cell is coated with insulin receptors, which provides the glucose with a channel to get into the cell. These insulin receptors are triggered to open when they're exposed to insulin. So insulin opens up the receptors and glucose is driven into the cell. So insulin is produced by an organ called the pancreas. So the pancreas makes insulin. The insulin binds to the insulin receptor, which opens up a channel so that glucose gets into the cell to be used. Hope you all got that. Well, that's how it works in normal individuals. In type 1 diabetes, insulin production is far too low. So this mechanism breaks down and sugar accumulates in the blood and doesn't make it into the cell. In type 2 diabetes, insulin can still be produced by the pancreas, but it's the receptors on the cell that are not working well. And the same thing happens. Hyperglycemia, too much blood sugar. So you see there's two types of diabetes, type 1 and type 2. Type 1 used to be referred to as juvenile diabetes because it usually would show itself at a younger age. Juvenile diabetics usually look on the outside as normal weight. This type 1 is also referred to as insulin-dependent diabetes because they can't produce insulin and must use external insulin to stay alive. This happens when certain pancreatic cells get destroyed, most often as an autoimmune process. Type 2 diabetes or adult onset diabetes are very often overweight and cannot utilize the insulin produced. In other words, they are insulin resistant. Type 2 diabetes, fortunately, can be corrected with lifestyle changes like weight loss, exercise, and better food choices. And it's far, far more common than type 1 diabetes. And I don't need to get into too much detail about the numbers and how large a problem diabetes is in our countries. You've heard this again and again, but at least 1 in every 3 people in North America either have diabetes or pre-diabetes. 1 in 3. This is huge. Okay, let's now look at glutathione. Just a quick review for those of you who are new to the subject. We always have new callers. Let's just start off by saying that life would not be possible without glutathione. All living creatures have glutathione in their cells. And when levels drop, bad things happen. When levels are high, greater health is obtained. When I first started talking about this topic, glutathione was pretty much an unknown word. This is 20, 25 years ago. Now, most people have at least heard of it, and that's because there's been over 180,000 scientific and medical articles published on it that can be found on the world's major research resource, a site called PubMed.gov. Every scientist, every researcher is on PubMed all the time. So just to put this number in context, 180,000, what does that mean? PubMed lists about 40,000 articles on vitamin C and another 80,000 or so on vitamin E. So there are more articles on glutathione than there are on vitamin C and vitamin E put together. So just to quickly review the roles of glutathione in health and illness, just remember the word idea, and you'll know 90% of what glutathione does in your body. Glutathione, what a great idea. What do these letters stand for? Let's look at them in turn. The I stands for the immune system. The D stands for detoxification. The E for energy. And finally, A for antioxidant. Looking a bit closer at these letters, glutathione is literally food or fuel for the immune system. With low glutathione levels, you'll express immunocompromise. With high glutathione levels, you have a chance to optimize your immune defenses. D is for detoxification. We're exposed to thousands of toxins and pollutants and chemicals in our atmosphere, and clearly these things can be very damaging. How do we get rid of them? Well, glutathione is our main detoxifying enzyme system to do this. Glutathione gets rid of cigarette smoke, automobile exhaust, pesticides, herbicides, heavy metals, and on and on. And I tell people that next to water, there is no more important detoxification system in the body. E stands for energy. We could spend a whole night just on this topic. Just one example, our cells have little structures in them called mitochondria. These mitochondria act like little batteries providing energy to the cell. And these little structures would literally burn up from oxidative stress if they did not have a constant supply of glutathione to cool them down from free radical damage. Finally, A for antioxidant. Glutathione is referred to as our master antioxidant. Why use this term master? Because we know of between 2,000 and 4,000 different antioxidants in science. Here's the key. None of these antioxidants could work were it not for the presence of glutathione. Glutathione recharges these other antioxidants. Glutathione recycles these antioxidants. The whole antioxidation system would break down in the absence of sufficient glutathione. So there you have it, the four major roles of glutathione in your body. And now you can appreciate why this molecule has such a profound effect on your health. So let's get back to diabetes. Besides having high blood sugar, another foundational problem in diabetes exists. Diabetics suffer from high levels of oxidative stress, meaning they have more oxidants than antioxidants, and consequently, they have high levels of free radical formation, which plays havoc in their metabolism. This needs to be appreciated before we go on to the rest of the lecture. Y'all got this? Diabetics have higher oxidative stress and free radical formation. Okay, this is what the basis of most of this talk is going to be. Now let's look at glutathione levels in diabetes. So, given that diabetics have high levels of oxidative stress and free radical damage, it's easy to predict that diabetics would have low levels of glutathione because the glutathione is being used up by fighting off this oxidative damage. Well, guessing is not enough, uh, even though it makes perfect sense. Many, many studies have looked at this, and pretty much all of the studies that have looked at glutathione levels in diabetes have found that these patients are deficient in glutathione. This is well established. Diabetic patients are glutathione deficient. So, does having low glutathione levels in diabetes matter? Does this affect the patient clinically? Well, yeah, absolutely. This glutathione deficiency leads to a cell which is much more prone to being damaged. If this is the case, can following glutathione levels be used to foresee diabetes and possibly be used as a prognostic tool? Again, the answer is yes. In this article, the authors are suggesting to do just that. Do glutathione measurements in the future to predict the onset of diabetes. While we're talking and looking at glutathione levels to predict disease, can we monitor glutathione levels to see whether treatment is effective? This article from Frontiers in Endocrinology did just that. What they showed was that glutathione levels improved as the patients improved. Very promising. This is also a reflection of glutathione levels correlating with levels of health. Now let's look at the flip side. What does it mean to the onset of diabetic complications if glutathione levels fall? This work has actually been done a long time ago. Here's a paper from 1996 that looked at the correlation between glutathione levels and medical complication rates in diabetic patients. Even back then, it was demonstrated that the lower the glutathione levels were, the higher the rate of diabetic complications and illness. So now we're getting to some real clinical relevance. So one of the fastest developing fields in medicine revolves around being able to read our genome, our DNA coding. What we've learned to do in the past few years would have been unimaginable not that long ago. We can now, and when I say we, I mean you and I, can spit into a bottle, send it off in the mail, and get our DNA genome read for less than $100. Now, one of the things that has become more and more apparent is there are dozens of different genes that encode for different glutathione-like molecules. And just like other genes, there can be subtle errors in the code. And this leads to changes on how glutathione behaves and consequently less than optimal glutathione functioning. How does this relate to diabetes? Now, here's just one of many studies that have looked at this. In this case, just two glutathione abnormal subtypes were examined, and both of these defects were associated with an increased risk of developing diabetes. These results have also been shown to exist for a good number of other glutathione or genetic aberrations. So it's clear that if glutathione is not functioning properly, diabetes can result. Wow. Now let's take a closer look at glutathione and sugar levels. Is there an inverse relation? In other words, can high glucose levels lead to low glutathione levels? This has been the subject of dozens of research studies. This review paper is from way back in 2003. And as we mentioned earlier on, diabetics have lower glutathione levels. This is a result a direct oxidation of glucose. Glucose itself is oxidized and is the source of a chain of free radical damage that lowers glutathione. And here we see as serum glucose goes up, as blood sugar goes up, glutathione levels plummet. This is as a result of burning up glutathione to quench the free radicals formed by the sugar. Is this problem irreversible? Is it reversible? Can we flip this association over by somehow raising glutathione? Yes, we can. By supplying glutathione precursors, this can be restored. What about hemoglobin A1C levels? For those of you who've never heard of hemoglobin A1C, A1C is a blood test that's used to follow how well a diabetic patient is controlled. In other words, if A1C is high, sugar levels are all over the map. If A1C is low, then the patient has been good at controlling their sugar. When we matching A1C levels with glutathione levels, we see that high levels of A1C reflect low levels of glutathione. Low levels of A1C correlate with high levels of glutathione. Very clear. Glutathione levels are directly related to good sugar control. Very important. Okay, all that being said, hold on, this may surprise you. We are not trying to control sugar or glucose levels by modulating glutathione. It's not what we're trying to do, not trying to control sugar levels. What we're trying to do is cut down on the consequences of having diabetes. We are trying to preserve the health of these patients, but not by controlling sugar levels. It goes much deeper than that. Let me explain. I'll start by asking a question. What is it that actually makes a diabetic person sick? What is it that shortens the life of a diabetic? The answer is not high sugar. That's just a mechanism that results in problems. What the actual pathologies that lead to illness and death, what we call morbidity and mortality. Think of these terms to roughly mean sickness and death. Well, there's actually a long list of different medical problems that diabetics can suffer from: stroke, heart attack, kidney failure, neuropathy, blindness, foot infections, and more. However, given this long list, you can summarize them all by looking at two main issues. Number one, the immune system. Diabetics, by definition, are immunocompromised. They are much more prone to the development of infection. And number two, diabetics' main problem is that their cardiovascular system is highly prone to damage and malfunction. This includes both large blood vessels and small blood vessels. Looking at the immune system, diabetics are much more likely to come down with a serious foot infection and other skin infections. Diabetics are more prone to yeast or fungal infections. Diabetics get many more urinary tract or bladder infections. So if you remember, one of glutathione's major roles is immune system support. Well, if you can improve the immune system in a diabetic, you can cut down on the amount of infectious complications they develop, and you can cut down both in morbidity and mortality. But the major cause of illness and death in this population is the effect that diabetes has on the cardiovascular system or circulatory system. When we look at the large blood vessels, what we refer to as the macrovascular system, diabetics are much higher risk of suffering from a stroke, from a heart attack, These are all two common causes of death here. When we look at the microvascular circulation, the small blood vessels, the problem is just as big. When circulation is impaired to the eye, you get diabetic blindness, which, by the way, is the most common cause of blindness in our population. When the circulation is impaired to the kidneys, you get renal failure or kidney failure. Again, diabetes is the major cause of kidney failure in this country, in all three of our countries. When the circulation to the nerves is affected, you can develop peripheral neuropathy. And you guessed it, diabetes is the number one cause of peripheral neuropathy as well. So the major cause of sickness and death in diabetics is because of poor circulation to the body, by far. So let's just take a moment to see how circulation becomes impaired. Let's look at a blood vessel, in this case, an artery, and see what happens. An artery has three layers: a tough outer fibrous layer, a middle muscular layer, and finally a very delicate and thin layer which lines the inside of the vessel. It's this thin inner layer called the endothelium, which is most prone to damage. And when it gets damaged, it gets inflamed and it develops a buildup, well, of what's called, let's call it crud, that starts to block the circulation that goes through these blood vessels. So think of inflammation in these arteries like a buildup of rust in a pipe. Now, this buildup is biochemically a bit complicated, but let's take a quick overview on how glutathione is involved. Let's look at the consequence of having lower glutathione. We all have fats, or what we call lipids, that circulate in our blood. They're important for many actions, but too much of this fat can lead to deposition inside the arteries. These fats you've probably heard of, for example, cholesterol or triglycerides. Well, glutathione can lower minimally the level of cholesterol. This accumulation of fats in the artery, they're prone to oxidation, what we call lipid peroxidation, which acts to inflame these tissues. So you may remember that glutathione is the master antioxidant. And so glutathione in the form of glutathione peroxidase, which is in your bloodstream, is the major enzyme that stops or slows down the oxidation of cholesterol. Glutathione also minimizes the inflammatory response of these tissues. And the inflamed tissue might attract clotting agents and platelets, which start to build up on the inflammation. Glutathione also functions to stabilize platelets. Finally, other substances start to build up, like calcium and other agents, and these just increase the size of blockage. All of this just forms a vicious cycle of oxidation and free radical damage, and eventually the artery is blocked by plaque. Again, glutathione is the major force trying to stop this from happening. The lower the glutathione, the more likely this process proceeds. So that's the theory. Let's look at the proof. Let's briefly look at a few clinical studies that detail the role of glutathione in diabetic heart disease. This article is a systematic review paper on the protection offered to diabetes by raising their glutathione levels. What a systematic review entails is examining all of the available research articles written on a subject and coming to a consensus about what has been found. It's a very, very powerful tool in research. And what this in-depth review paper concluded after dissecting all of the articles written was that, yes, raising glutathione in diabetic patients cut down on cardiovascular complications. These included heart attacks suffered by the group, This is what I would consider clear evidence. What about stroke? Is there a relationship between stroke, which we also refer to as a cerebrovascular accident, and glutathione levels in diabetics? Well, first of all, let me remind you again that diabetics suffer a much greater amount of stroke than a non-diabetic population. This has been well established. Now, in this study, glutathione levels were examined along with other markers of oxidative stress in stroke patients in the whole population. Then they compared the numbers between diabetic patients and non-diabetic patients. And as expected, the diabetic patients had significantly lower glutathione levels than the non-diabetic patients. So low glutathione levels can be considered as a risk factor for stroke in diabetes. What about kidney disease? What about kidney failure or renal failure? Here in these Chinese studies, diabetic patients had genetic testing for a type of glutathione defect. And again, those diabetics with the defective glutathione gene were much more prone to the development of diabetic kidney disease. A large meta-analysis was carried out looking at other genetic glutathione abnormalities. Again, these diabetics with the abnormally functioning glutathione enzymes were shown to have more renal failure or more kidney failure. In the journal Nephrurology, another approach was taken. Glutathione levels and selenium levels. Let me explain to you that the active form of selenium in the body is through a molecule called glutathione peroxidase, was measured in diabetics with kidney disease. And what they found was that the level of glutathione correlated with the degree of kidney disease presence. In other words, glutathione levels could be predictive of how bad the kidney failure was going to be. As mentioned earlier, secondary blindness numbers show that the most common cause is also diabetic retinal disease. As with diabetic kidney disease, the same correlation can be shown between glutathione levels and the presence of retinopathy or eye disease in diabetics. The lower the glutathione levels, the higher the degree of retinopathy. What about neuropathy or peripheral nerve disease? Again, diabetes is the number one cause. And here we see that the levels of glutathione deficiency can be used as a predictor of the severity of the neuropathy. These doctors in this study tried to see if raising glutathione levels in diabetic neuropathy would help. And the answer was yes. Without getting into the details, this is useful information. So while that was a lot of information, all good to know, but what you really need to know is the following. The main message here is that although raising glutathione may have a small effect on blood sugar levels, that's not why we're using this strategy of raising glutathione. The main strategy here is to diminish or avoid the consequences that come along with having diabetes, the majority of which are circulatory problems. The idea here is to prevent the long-term consequences of the disease we call diabetes. And that, my friends, is true preventive medicine. So thank you very much for your attention. I know that was a longer than usual presentation, but extremely relevant to the population we have at hand.